I just I've come to understand that Dr. Canavero, who joined us in the preceding hour to talk about head transplantation, has invited the Coast to Coast crew to come on down to Annapolis in June for his big presentation and moving this project along, head transplants. And I'm just going to put it on public record that I will volunteer myself to be patient number 2. They can take my head and transplant it on the body of Triple H, assuming he's good for that. he might want to have a word in that. Anyway, and then they can donate the rest of my body to science fiction. The infamous Waverly Hills Sanatorium, long a favorite destination for ghost hunters visiting Kentucky, is set to become a hotel where guests can stay and possibly have paranormal experiences. I'm sure Rosemary Ellen Guiley will be among the first guests. In addition to 120 hotel rooms, plans also include a restaurant, conference center, and a museum focusing on the history of the hospital. The mystery booms and rumbles, or rather the mysterious booms and rumbles heard at various locations around the world continue. Reports of a new round of booming noises are coming from the Washington state cities of Port Angeles and Joyce, where residents say the mysterious sounds have shaken their homes. And you can read more about these fascinating stories at the In the News section at coasttocoastam.com. Thanks to webmaster Sean Ladouceur for that. Great job, Sean. Just thinking about that Waverly Hills Sanatorium. And of course, the great song by the Eagles, Hotel California. Never mind the Hotel California, the Waverly Hills Hotel. You can check in, but you cannot check out. My conversation with Pastor Carl Gallups, and we'll discuss his new book, Final Warning, God's Final Warning, talking about the 7 trumpets. Are you familiar with the 7 trumpets in the book of Revelation? Well, you will be. Maybe you'll learn more than you want to know when Coast to Coast continues right after this. All right, strap yourself in and get ready. Carl Gallups is the longtime senior pastor of Hickory Hammock Baptist Church in Florida. He is the author of the bestseller Magic Man in the Sky and The Rabbi Who Found Messiah. That caused quite a stir, I'll tell you. Additionally, he's a conference leader, evangelist, Christian media icon. He's one of the founders of video teaching material to the world-famous P.P. Simmons YouTube ministry and Biblical Apologetics channel. He's a graduate of Florida State University. He's a former law enforcement official. He wears many hats. And the New Orleans Baptist Theology Seminary, and his new book is called Final Warning. Carl Gallups, welcome to Coast. How are you?
Richard, I'm doing wonderful. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here with you tonight or this morning, whichever it may be, wherever you are coast to coast. But I'm trying to picture your head on top of Triple H's body. I can't get that picture out of my mind.
Well, then let's just
be
move.
Able to sleep comfortably again.
I apologize. Let's just move on. Nothing here to see, folks. Just go on home to your families.
It's a train wreck.
That pretty well sums up the situation.
Fascinating interview before. I enjoyed it.
Final warning, understanding the trumpet days of Revelation. Quite frankly, it's a little frightening, Carl. I mean, whenever I read about biblical prophecy, and I try and connect what the prophets were saying, and I connect that to modern day news headlines, and I see the two sort of mirroring each other, I think, oh boy, here we go. Let's first of all talk a little bit about Revelation, because as I mentioned in my intro earlier on, there is perhaps no other piece of literature that is so controversial, so misquoted, so misunderstood as the final book of the New Testament. Revelation.
Yeah.
Give us some context.
Yeah,
Who wrote it and when?
Yeah, well, Richard, first of all, I think you're right in the last statement you made. And let me just say several things about that. First of all, I want to go back to the first statement you made about being scary to see things happening in the world around us, and then knowing that they were first written in the Word of God, and they seem to be mirroring passages of Scripture and or passages of Scripture, conversely, seem to be mirroring things that are happening. And here's the context of that first. The Bible is clear. Well, first of all, the Bible is the only, and I'm going to use the word religious for a moment, the only religious book in the world that dares to make prophetic statements about things that are going to happen in the last days. And I'm going to explain what that word last days means, because that's what scares people the most. But there is a context to that is not scary at all. But the Bible's the only religious book in the world that does that. And these statements were made, these prophecies were made, these predictions, if you will, were made. The youngest of them are 2,000 years old. Some of them are 3,000 years old or older. Yet here they are, or some of them have already unfolded, like the return of Israel. That was in the Scriptures for 2,500 years. Yet we're the only generation in the history of the world to see Israel come back. And there it is, since 1948. And then in 1967, they recaptured Jerusalem. Well, there are all kinds of prophecies about Jerusalem in the last days, and about how the enemies of Israel will surround Israel and will surround Jerusalem. Well, first they had to recapture it. Well, that has happened. We're the only generation to see it. And the Bible is the only book in the world, the only religious piece of literature in the world to say that these things would happen. So as we see it unfold before our eyes, and of course, as this interview goes on tonight, I'll be sharing things that will be absolutely mind-blowing to many of your listeners, the key words that are in the book of Revelation that key right into modern-day historical events of prophecy that are happening before our eyes. So as these things unfold, Richard, for those that are right with God, through Jesus Christ, according to the Word of God, then this should not be a scary thing, but rather the Bible tells us, actually the Bible says when we see these things that we're to take comfort in these things. Therefore, we are to encourage each other with these words, the Scripture says. Why?
Let me just jump in for a second, Carl. Excuse me. I just want to mention this because I know full well that whenever the terms biblical prophecy come up, or revelation, and those who are not necessarily God believing individuals,
yes,
might say, well, tune out. But here's the thing, if and I was dealing with this on the email prior to the show. If someone were to come on and they wanted to talk about Hopi Indian prophecies, and they're very fascinating, and they have sort of an end times. There's kind of an eschatology there too, or the Mayans,
sure.
The Mayan calendar. So if you'd permit me just for a second, let's take God out of the equation for a moment. Here we have thousands of years ago, in this case, a gentleman named John on the island of Patmos writing these things down. Never mind where it came from, but he's writing these things down, and now we are seeing this parallel between what he wrote down and what is happening now on the world stage. That's got to be interesting to people, whether or not you believe in God.
Oh yeah, no. Listen, I agree with that proposition. You're absolutely right. And the point I was making, and then I want to jump right into John on the island of Patmos, as you were just saying. The point I was making though is that we can talk about the Hopi Indians and the various writings of various groups, but none of them even come close to the exacting fulfillments of geopolitical, national, international events that have unfolded before our eyes and are still unfolding before our eyes. So the Bible, as you said, taking God out of the equation, the Bible just as a piece of literature is an amazing. There's nothing like it in the world. It is unique unto all the other books in the world that would contain anything about prophecy, particularly end-time prophecy. But you're right. Let's talk about John on the island of Patmos. That occurred 2,000 years ago. He was placed there. It was a Roman prison camp, a penal colony, a rocky island, a quarry, and that's where political prisoners were kept and religious prisoners, and many of them were sentenced there to life. So here was John on this island. Now, so John claims that he receives this revelation from the throne room of God. All right. Well, you come to the book of Revelation, and you said earlier on that it was one of the most controversial pieces of literature in the world, and particularly of those connected with the Scriptures, the Bible. And one of the reasons, I think, is because it is written in such highly symbolic, sensational fashion. I mean, it's obvious that some of it is symbolic, and then of course some of it's literal, and it depends upon context, and most of that's pretty easy to figure out.
It's a veritable quagmire, Carl. It is a quagmire.
Well, not if one has studied the Scriptures from Genesis to Revelation and puts it in context. There's a whole lot of it that's understandable, Richard, and that's one of the things I do in my book, Final Warning, is to put a lot of that together. This book that I've written is not meant to be a complete understanding of every word of Revelation, but what I'm trying to do is to help people understand, first of all, how biblical prophecy is written, secondly, some 5 or 6 or 7 very important keys to understanding biblical prophecy, particularly Revelation prophecy, and we'll talk about a lot of that tonight. And then I focus in on those trumpet visions, because those are kind of central to the book of Revelation, and millions of people around the world. I'm not the only one, but I'm probably the only one that's written a book that's been published by a major publisher on this topic, but if not the only, one of the only ones. But millions of people see key word connections that are just absolutely astounding, that are unfolding in our lifetime, in our historical lifetime, some of them even in today's headline news. So,
all right. If you were to, excuse me, Carl, but if you were to summarize what Revelation is about, the book in the New Testament, if you were to summarize it in a few sentences, I mean, what is Revelation about?
Yeah. Okay. Here's what Revelation is about. For those that belong to God in Jesus Christ, in the end, we win. That's what it is. It's a book of hope and victory for those that know the Word of God from beginning to end. But it sets the understanding that God has a plan. This whole thing that we call life is unfolding in God's plan and in His timing. He's bringing all things to the conclusion that He has desired for a new creation, a new heaven, a new earth, a restored paradise, as it was meant to be from the beginning. And for our atheist and agnostic and non-Christian friends listening in abundance out there, without preaching to them or trying to convert them, what is the takeaway for them? Yeah. Well, you kind of tie in my hands by saying without preaching to them, because that's the whole purpose of the book of Revelation, is to show people that the gospel of Jesus Christ is the truth. And the way we know that is because the book of Revelation, which ends the New Testament and therefore the Bible, it's all wrapped up in the person of Jesus Christ. He is the one who gives this revelation to John. And so now the test of that is as we follow through time, is what John wrote, is it actually unraveling before us? Is it actually happening? And so, but I guess what I'm going after is it sort of, does it not sort of lay out the chronology of how the end times, however you want to interpret that, how the end times will unfold? Mm-hmm. Is that not what what Revelation is about? How the end times will unfold? Yes, it certainly is. But it's not laid out in a perfect chronological fashion. As many prophecy experts believe that it is not, and I'm one of those that believe it's not laid out in a perfect chronological fashion, but it uses a process of what's called recapitulation, where it will tell a general understanding or a general story of where it's going, and then it will back up. There are certain sections in the book of Revelation where it backs up, it focuses in, it takes a deeper look at a very specific thing that is being said, and extrapolates upon that, and then picks up and moves forward again. And that's a difficult style of Hebrew literature. It's a difficult style of biblical prophetic understanding that requires some study and some time and really years of studying the Scripture. And I think that that this was given this way by God, because it was not meant to be a chart or a graph or a map where just anybody could pick it up and look at it and say, oh, well, here's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. It doesn't read like that. It was not meant to be read like that. But when one knows the Bible from Genesis to Revelation and understands the whole picture of what God is doing in the universe, what He has been doing, what the Creator has intended from the beginning and where it's moving, and when you know that there are key words there that relate back to other scriptures which define those key words, and then when you see those key words coming to life within the headline of your news, your daily news, and most of them only within a singular generation of human history, well, that's when people stand up and take notice and say, oh my gosh.
That's right. That's where the biblical rubber hits the road, as they say. Carl Gallups is with us, author of Final Warning, Understanding the Trumpet Days of Revelation. Now, we are approaching a break here at the bottom of the hour. Let's begin this discussion, and then we'll continue on afterwards. Let's talk about what we mean, or what is meant by, the trumpet days. Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, I know we've only got a little bit, so I'll give the brief definition, and we can talk about it much deeper as we move along. Richard, thank you. What I mean by the trumpet days is that in chapter 8 and chapter 9 and 10 and 11, there is a series we are introduced to of 7 trumpets. The number 7 is important. The number 7 is a biblical number meaning completion and perfection. So there's something complete, there's something perfect about these visions that are given. Now, they're a little cryptic, and they seem to be written very symbolically, and for 2,000 years since they were given, people have, debated and struggled over what these things could mean. And, of course, my book is written to show the readers that, look, there's key words there that were given 2,000 years ago that had literally no meaning until now. And all of a sudden, these key words code to specific events that are happening in history. So what I mean by trumpet days is when we focus in on those 7 trumpet blasts that seem to be warnings. That's what trumpets are in the Bible. They're warnings, mainly to God's people, to wake up. Something big is getting ready to happen. Something is happening. Something's going to happen. Many people believe that the 7th trumpet is representative of the rapture of the church, just before the return of the Lord. And I'm one of those. I think that that's what the 7th trumpet represents. Therefore, the 6 trumpets prior to that are biblical harbingers. They're warnings to God's people mainly, but just to the world in general. Those that would take the time to study the Word and to see what's happening around us. These are announcements to the world that, look, time's getting short. The Lord's on His way back. We need to be right with God. And that's what I mean by the trumpet days of Revelation. I think that perhaps, and as I said, millions of people around the world do too, I think perhaps we might be living in those trumpet days now. I think the trumpets are sounding biblically, and I think it's getting very, very close. I don't set dates. I don't run around saying the sky is falling. I'm not a sensationalist. I'm a senior pastor of a church for 28 years, a solid conservative church. But I do know the Scriptures. I do know what's going on around us. I keep track of it. I am on radio and TV a lot, as you know, and I have to know these things. And so when I see what's happening around us and I compare them to what I know about the Scriptures, I'm just telling people I think it's time that people get serious, take a look at this. We may be living in the trumpet days of Revelation, those days of warning.
We get 7 warnings. That's it, no more. Now, let's just tease this. I don't want to pursue this, but we'll unravel it a little bit later. Where are we in the toots on that apocalyptic horn, my friend?
I love that description, Richard. Where are we on the toots? Yeah. Well, I think really we only get 6 warnings. The 7th would be, if I understand it correctly, the rapture of the church. So
okay. So how many have we had?
Okay. It seems to be that the first 5 have already blown, and we may be in the very edges of trumpet number 6. And of course, I look forward to explaining that as we move along.
Wow. All right. Carl Gallups, the author of Final Warning, Understanding the Trumpet Days of Revelation. My name is Richard Serrett. You're listening to Coast. Jet, are you going to be my girl? Taking us into the break. And we are coming to you live from the shiny studios of Chorus Radio and News Talk AM 640 here in Toronto on the shores of frigid Lake Ontario, although it is getting warmer. Thank the Lord for that. We have endured a lot, haven't we? If you happen to be in the greater Toronto area, Sunday, April the 26th, I hope you'll consider joining me. I'm presenting a live event at the Regent Theatre in downtown Oshawa, just a stone's throw from downtown Toronto, where I'm speaking from. Sunday, April the 26th, it's called Follow the Truth, and bringing some pretty remarkable speakers to town for a Sunday night evening. Sunday, April the 26th, we'll be presenting a JFK assassination researcher who will unpack the Zapruder film frame by frame. We'll discuss the lost and found tribes of Israel. There'll be an exact replica of the Shroud of Turin on stage, and I'll be interviewing a professor of chemistry about the Shroud. Also, Canada's Edgar Casey, Dr. Douglas James Cottrell will be doing a remote viewing experiment live on stage. Rosemary Ellen Guiley will be doing a spirit communication live on stage, and much more. That's Follow the Truth, and you can get all the details at followthetruth.tv. Hope to see you there. Now, my good friends at WND.com, WorldNet Daily exclusive, and Leo Homan just released this exclusive story. Holy Altar constructed for Third Jewish Temple. End Times prophecy watchers are marveling over a news report out of Jerusalem this week that the altar of the Lord has been reconstructed by the Temple Institute. The Institute, based in the old city of Jerusalem, announced it has finished building an altar that is essentially ready for use in sacrificial services. The altar is the most ambitious project to date toward the goal of rebuilding the Jewish temple. This would be number 3, right? The third temple. The massive outdoor altar, which took several years to build, can be operational a little more than at a moment's notice, reported the Israel magazine Matzav Haruk. The altar is the last major component needed for the long obstructed sacrifices to resume in a future Jewish temple. Ultra-Orthodox Jews pray daily for its reconstruction atop the holy hill known as Mount Moriah or the Temple Mount. Bible scholars say the rebuilding of the ancient temple is predicted throughout Scripture, starting with Daniel's vision in Daniel 9:27. Jesus echoed Daniel's warning about an abomination standing in the holy place in the last days in Matthew 24:15, followed by the Apostle John's vision of the temple in Revelation chapters 11, verses 1 and 2. And Paul mentioned it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Well, I'm guessing Carl Gallups might have something to say about that as well. Could that be one of the 7 trumpets? We'll find out when we discuss Final Warning, when Coast to Coast continues right after this. 7 trumpets are sounded, one at a time, to cue apocalyptic events that were seen in the vision of the revelation of Christ Jesus by John of Patmos, the Apostle John, as written in the book of Revelation of the New Testament. The 7 trumpets are sounded by 7 angels, and the events that follow are described in detail from Revelation chapters 8 to 11. According to Revelation chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, the angels sound these trumpets after the breaking of the 7th seal. These seals secured the apocalyptic document that was in the right hand of him who sits on the main throne. Pastor Carl Gallups joins us, and we are discussing his new book, Final Warning. Okay, so you set it up quite nicely, the 7 trumpets, and you hinted at that we may be on the precipice of hearing number 6, but let's just dial it back, Carl. And you know, we're not going to reveal all here, obviously, in the 3 hours, but give us a hint at some of the earlier trumpets that sounded, and how we can verify those trumpets were a fulfillment, prophesied in Revelation were fulfilled during either this lifetime or in the recent past.
Yeah. Hey, that's an excellent way to start it, Richard. Thank you so much for that setup. I appreciate it. Yeah, let's deal with trumpet number 3, because that's kind of where my journey began with all this, and I want your listeners to know 2 things about this. First of all, this is not stuff that I've just pulled out of my back pocket to write some kind of a sensational book. Now, what's in this book, a lot of it's very sensational. I mean, it's astounding. But this is stuff that I've been researching and examining, preaching to, speaking to, doing conferences on for 25 years, a quarter of a century. People have been begging me all during this time, write this stuff down, put this in a book, document this stuff, resource this stuff. So that's the first thing I want people to know. The second thing I want your listeners to know is that the things that I'm going to say to save us time in the interview, I'll just say it now in a sentence, and that is, everything that I'm going to say from this point forward regarding some of the claims that I'm going to make are impeccably resourced in my book. I'm talking about from military sources, from historical sources, from scientific journals, from United Nations documents and transcripts of speeches, from mainstream media articles, New York Times headline articles, National Geographic articles, etc. Plus, of course, for the biblical statements I make, they are resourced from the Scriptures in a contextual study. So I just want the listeners to know, because some of the things I'm going to say to your listeners that have never heard this, they're going to say, oh, my gosh, that can't be. Is that true? Well, yes, and get the book, read what I have researched for 25 years, and then look at the resources, look at the sources. Well, so now let me answer your question. Thank you for asking it that way. Here's an example. Trumpet number 3, it's just 2 or 3 sentences long, and it says, as a matter of fact, I've got it right here in front of me. It says, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood, and a third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. So it's just 2 sentences, 2 verses. But here's now that I've read it literally from the Scriptures, let me just kind of paraphrase it again, and let me show you how this is where my journey began, Richard, because it names. There's a key word there. See, here's the thing. So much of Revelation it has imagery. You know, a dragon coming up out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 crowns. A giant locust with a face like a man and hair like a woman and fire shooting out of the tails. You know, I mean, this stuff sounds science fiction. But remember, you got a man sitting on a rock island 2,000 years ago who was thrust into at least our lifetime, Richard, at least 2,000 years into the future. But watch this, trumpet number 3. You're moving along through this imagery, and all of a sudden, there's a name dropped in there. The name of this star, or the name of this revelation, the name of this trumpet is Wormwood. Now, that's astounding because that does relate specifically to something within our historical lifetime, and it never related to anything like that before. And I'm going to reveal that right here. But as you move along, like the 5th trumpet, it says, and the name of the one that started all this was Abaddon or Apollyon. So you see, these are the things that I focus in on in my book, these things where it says, and the name of this was, or the image of it was like this, and it describes something. So now, back to trumpet number 3, Richard. So you've got something that happens that involves something appearing as though it's coming from the sky. It's fiery. It pollutes water. That's a main feature here. It kills a lot of people. That's
right. Men will die from drinking its bitter taste.
Exactly. And then it says, and the name of this thing is called Wormwood. Let me tell you what. Back in 1987, or 88, I think it was, I was preaching through the book of Revelation, and I was in these passages, and I had felt before that the trumpets were things that were meant to speak to our days. And while I was preaching through this, there was an article that appeared in the New York Times that was picked up by regional newspapers. Remember, back then, we didn't have internet. We didn't have computers in our homes, you know. All of that was just getting started, and people didn't have them personally. So I had no way of checking this out, but I get a New York Times article that says that the people in Ukraine were basically freaking out, all the way from Ukrainian officials to people in the street, because in 1986 the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred. The worst nuclear accident in the history of the world, released over 100 times the radiation that the bomb at Hiroshima released, that the nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki released, 100 times that radiation, and it polluted waters. The town of Chernobyl, the city of Chernobyl, 200,000 people evacuated, thousands of people died, millions of people radiation poisoned. Now, again, all of this is documented in my book from scientific sources. I'm not just making this stuff up. To this day, a week ago, I checked this out to make sure it was still accurate. To this day, Chernobyl is at least 10 times more deadly than Fukushima, and we know the devastation of Fukushima. But Chernobyl is still the worst. And
they are still attributing, because there's been a huge surge in thyroid cancers all over the world.
Oh, yeah.
And many oncologists attribute that to Chernobyl.
Well, listen, not only is that documented in my book, but in the church where I pastor, we have a lot of medical professionals, and I asked several of them while I was writing the book, or before I was writing the book, actually, I asked them to confirm that. I said, listen, you go to all these American Medical Association meetings, you go to all these update meetings and training sessions. I said, is there anything to the fact that thyroid cancer rates have skyrocketed in the United States over the last 20, 30 years? And they all said, well, yes, that's absolutely true. And I said, and what's it attributed to? And they said, well, they're telling us that a lot of it came from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and the radiation fallout that swept across Europe and even across the Atlantic and into the eastern seaboard of the United States and beyond. Now that's from people in my church that are in the medical field. So, and then of course when I researched that and I've got the resources in my book, that's a fact. And so, but watch, here's the thing. So I'm preaching this back in the mid '80s, mid to late '80s, and I come across this New York Times article, and here's the shocking thing: the people that experienced Chernobyl, they said, in the English Bible, the name of this event is wormwood, but if you're reading a Ukrainian Bible, it says the name of this event is Chernobyl. I mean, because wormwood translates into Ukrainian as Chernobyl, or that's the Russian pronunciation. Kornobyl is how it is in Ukraine. Now, I know if your listeners are hearing this for the first time, they're thinking, wow, that's just too obvious. I mean, that word correlation is, I mean, if what this guy is saying, if what Carl Gallups is saying is true, then, I mean, that's almost undeniable. Well, that's the point I'm making in my book.
Right,
These word correlations, and this is just one of many that I point out, word and image correlations, they are. I mean, this is either a collection of some of the biggest, monumental, unbelievable coincidences in the world, coming from only one book and right out of a series of 7 trumpets, or it might just be prophecy unfolding before our eyes. So,
why would the Ukrainians have a name for wormwood? In other words, what I'm asking is, what is a wormwood?
Thank you.
What does that word mean?
Yeah, well, it is written different ways in different languages, but the base root meaning of it is bitterness or poison. Okay, and so that's what Chernobyl is, the name of a plant. Of a weed, if you will. In fact, absinthe comes from it. There's a drug and a drink that's made from it. It's termed as the green fairy. It's a drink. It's I can't
Okay, so
remember.
I got you. It's a bitter plant, and so wormwood is a bitter plant.
Yeah, it's got drug qualities to it in certain ways. It can be poisonous if you're not careful with it, etc. So that's what it's named for. That stuff grows wild in that area over there, and so that area is known as Chernobyl, and then the city of Chernobyl, and then of course the nuclear plant built this technology, only our lifetime technology. John the Revelator, if he's sitting on a rock island, they're riding camels 2,000 years ago. How can he describe what does he know about nuclear power plants and nuclear bombs and interstate
right? But
highways?
why would he describe it as a star?
Okay, well, that is a good question, and here's the answer to it. The star is a messenger. It's a harbinger, and here's how we know. Because if you read just two more trumpets in, trumpet 5, it says, "And I saw another star, and this time the star speaks, and the star proclaims something." So now we know that we're not talking about a literal star. This is imagery for messengers, for harbingers. In other words, proclaiming, look, something, this star coming from the sky. So there's something heavenly about it, perhaps. Perhaps it's falling from the literal sky, and I want to go back to Chernobyl in just a moment and describe that. But people have said to me over the years, well, this couldn't be the Chernobyl that happened over there because it says it was a star. And the first thing I say is, well, it could be the Chernobyl because that's what the word means. That's the definition for it if you're reading a Ukrainian Bible. The name of the star was Chernobyl. But secondly, I tell people, look, we know it's not a literal star. How do we know that? Because a star is a sun. You know that, Richard. A star. That's
right.
what a star
right.
is. It's a sun.
Right.
Well, our sun is one of the smallest that we know of, and we know that if our Earth were just a few thousand miles closer to the sun, we'd burn up. So a star doesn't hit the Earth. A sun couldn't hit the Earth. The Earth would burn to nothingness before it even got close to a sun. And even if a star did hit the Earth, it would do a whole lot more than just pollute a little water and kill a few people. So
we know that John. We know that John was not being literal when he when he talks about a star.
Exactly. So we know that he's, and then as I said, you go a couple trumpets further, and you find that that star speaks. So we know he's talking about this is a messenger, this is a harbinger. But watch, let me tell you, audience, what happened in nuclear reactor number 4 that night in 1986 when that thing blew. And I've got all of this documented in my book. Watch this. This is amazing. Look at the detail of how it matches this prophecy. The 200 million pound concrete lid that was on top of nuclear reactor number 4 burst, of course, blew up into a fiery blaze of pieces of concrete and metal. And the scientific sources say that mass of radiation poisoned concrete and metal was on fire. It shot over a half a mile into the sky, Richard, and came raining back down on the city of Chernobyl and that plant, polluting, of course, the waters and the soil, killing people, radiation poisoning people. Thousands died relatively immediately, and thousands more would die over the next few years, dying gruesome, horrible deaths. Millions of people, according to the scientific journals, have been radiation poisoned and will die much sooner than they should because of it. The city of Chernobyl was evacuated. It's evacuated to this day. Imagine a city of 200,000, 300,000 people just being gone.
No,
I mean,
that's true. We haven't seen the end. The final chapter on Chernobyl has yet to be written. Listen, Carl, we are coming up on a break, so let's reconnoiter on the other side, and we will discuss trumpets 4, 5, and perhaps even 6. Final warning: understanding the trumpet days of Revelation with Carl Gallups right here on Coast to Coast AM. Stay a while. Enjoying the guitar wizardry of David Lindley. And a lot of people have recorded that song, Mercury Blues, but I like David Lindley's version best. How about you? We are talking final warning, understanding The Seven Trumpets of Revelation with Carl Gallups, and we will get back to that conversation in just a few moments. And then in the final hour of the program, a mere 53 minutes and counting away, we will open up the lines and your questions and comments for Carl Gallups. Again, we are discussing the Seven Trumpets of Revelation. We ain't talking Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis here, my friends. Back with more here on Coast to Coast AM. We are back here on Coast to Coast AM. Richard Syrett, broadcasting from Toronto. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Syrett and the website richardsyrett.com. Carl Gallups is with us as we discuss the Seven Trumpets of Revelation. And we were talking before the break, Carl, of trumpet number 3, which certainly, a lot of coincidences perhaps, but it seems to be pointing directly at the Chernobyl nuclear accident of 1986, April 1986, coming up on the 29th anniversary. And the trumpet talks about wormwood, or John, rather. The Apostle John mentions that this star, and the name of the star is Wormwood, and you've drawn the parallels between Wormwood and Chernobyl. Wormwood in Ukrainian is, you say, Chernobyl, or Chernobyl in Ukrainian means wormwood. All right, now, let me just back up on that a little bit, just for those who missed it. Now, again, for those who don't understand how John could mistake a nuclear accident for a star, explain that one more time quickly.
Yeah. And then if you'll allow me, there are two more startling things about this that I just really need for your audience to know about this Trumpet 3. But yes, how could he? Well, first of all, he's on a rock island 2,000 years ago. They're still riding camels and walking everywhere they're going. How does a man in that condition, who's thrust into our lifetime and beyond, everything he sees looks like science fiction? How do you describe airplanes and space shuttles and rocket ships and nuclear bombs and nuclear technology, nuclear power plants and major wars, World War I, World War II, all the Middle East uprising, just skyscrapers, interstate highways, automobiles? How do you describe that? Well, you have to use imagery. You have to use the best descriptions of what you have in your day and time. Plus, you got to remember, John was also writing to the church of his day. It was the 7 letters to the 7 churches. So there was a meaning, there was a level of comfort and encouragement, and there was a level of understanding for the people, the church of his day. Plus, it also had to speak to the people of God and whoever else would be willing to look at it in the very last days. So what a monumental undertaking, but God gives him the words, he gives him the imagery, but in the meantime, from peppered throughout the book of Revelation are these clues, these what I call key word associations, and trumpet number 3 is a perfect example because at the end of it he says, and the name of it, John, write this down, is, and of course it was probably given in Hebrew and written in Greek. Of course we translate it to English and it's wormwood, but if it's translated to Ukrainian, it's Chernobyl. Now, so that's how he would describe it. He said, I saw this it's something fiery coming from the heavens, and it pollutes waters, it pollutes the ground, the waters, and it kills people, and it's on fire, and it's falling from the sky. Well, as I said, I've got it all documented in my book. You've got this nuclear reactor number 4 that blows over a half a mile into the sky, concrete chunks and steel radiated on fire, falling, raining down upon the city and upon the nuclear reactor area. Polluting waters, polluting the ground, killing people, radiating, poisoning. Here we are almost 30 years later, Richard, and the place is uninhabitable, and radiation poisoning has blown and leaked all over Europe and into the eastern seaboard of the United States and beyond, and now thyroid cancer rates have gone up astronomically in the United States and in Europe, all related to Chernobyl.
Has it in fact, Carl, though, can we verify that Chernobyl or wormwood has in fact poisons a third of the planet's freshwater sources? Because that's John says, specifically,
Yes,
a third.
Yes, thank you for asking that. First of all, I do a deep study of that in my book, and it's interesting. People, they look at all this, they see all of this imagery and all of this symbolism, but when they see these terms third, and it's one third is used throughout it, they want to, all of a sudden, they want to be literal with that. In other words, everything else is symbolic, but they say, oh, but it's one third. But when you do a study of the original language of the New Testament, the Greek, where it says earth, one third of the earth, we immediately think when we use that word earth in the English, we use it in many different ways. If I reach my hand into the soil, I'm planting a garden, and I say, boy, the earth is this earth is gorgeous here, isn't it? Look how dark this is. We might say dirt, but we could say earth. Or we could speak of a certain geographical location, or we could speak of the globe. Well, as a matter of fact, in the Greek, that word earth does not have to mean the entire globe. As a matter of fact, the first and most predominant word, translation of that Greek word, means a certain geographical location, or what we would say a theater, So it doesn't have to be the literal whole earth. And the number one third doesn't have to be literal, although I don't have a problem with that. I mean, God can certainly, point out very literal amounts. But think of the number one third for a minute, Richard, and I point this out in my book. If it is symbolic, what does it mean? Well, if you look at a pie, the whole pie is 3/3, of course. The vast majority of the pie is 2/3. But 1/3 would mean, well, it's not the whole thing, and it's not even the vast majority of it, but it's a good chunk. It is something that's noteworthy. It's something that's it's enough that the world would have to take notice of it. It's a big enough event. It's a big enough thing that you can't ignore it. And that's what I believe this number 1/3, which is pervasive throughout these trumpets, I think that's what that means. Now it could be literal as well, but I don't think that it has to mean, if you do a study of the words and of the imagery and of the symbolism, it doesn't have to mean 1/3 of the entire globe. Now, here's what's interesting about all of this. Richard, I've got documented in my book, there were 2 United Nations ambassadors, and they went before, one of them was the president of the General Assembly one year. Right after this nuclear explosion in Chernobyl, one of them went before the UN, quoted Revelation chapter 8, and the third trumpet vision, chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. He quoted that, and then talked about wormwood meaning Chernobyl, and then said this, what has happened to us is imagery that comes straight out of the Bible. I mean, this was a United Nations ambassador from the Ukraine, who's born and raised in Ukraine. This particular guy spoke 4 or 5 languages, Ukrainian being his native language. Yes. 11 years later, another Ukrainian ambassador, because Chernobyl 11 years later was still horrible. And he gives another speech, a lengthy speech. And in that speech, he talks about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. He quotes this scripture again. This is a completely different ambassador. He, again, affirms that the word wormwood means Chernobyl and vice versa, that it translates that way. So all of this is documented in the book. But watch how this ties in to today's headline news. I mean, today's headline news, Richard. Watch. So this has all happened almost 30 years ago, 29 years ago this April, as you said, is the anniversary. So let's just round it off, say about 30 years ago. 30 years ago, all right? But watch. When it exploded, 100 times more radiation than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they immediately set about trying to contain this thing because it was still spewing radiation. So they built a concrete sarcophagus over the whole thing. Your listeners can get on Google. National Geographic has been running articles on this for years. They built this huge concrete, they entombed it, they encased it in a big concrete covering, a sarcophagus. but the concrete sarcophagus was designed only to last about 20 years. And they knew that that would buy them some time. By the way, hundreds of people died, and some say thousands of people died building that sarcophagus because of radiation poisoning.
Right,
but,
yes, that's true.
Yeah, but what they did, they said, look, we got to buy some time. So they bought themselves 20 years. Well, we're 29 years later. So guess what? Just this last year or two, they realized, the thing is cracking. It's starting to leak a little bit and to leach, and they know that if it crumbles apart, scientists say it'll be worse than the first explosion, if you can imagine that. Worse than. Well, so they begin to, again, National Geographic 4 or 5 years ago wrote a huge piece on that, and they talked about it in great detail about how terrible it would be if they don't get that thing patched, repaired, or something else built around it to contain it. Well, so a couple of years ago, they start working on it, and they're working feverishly on it, and they're trying to contain this waiting disaster that could be worse than the first. And guess what happens in this last year? Russia attacks Ukraine. And, of course, Russia figures prominently into biblical prophecy and biblical end times prophecy. A lot of people equate it to, Gog and Magog prophecies, and some people dispute that. But the bottom line is a lot of people see a picture of Russia being involved in the last days as being a tremendous aggressor that kind of stirs things up in Europe and the Middle East. Now we've got Russia attacking Ukraine, while Ukraine is feverishly trying to contain this nuclear disaster that's threatening to become even more disastrous. And in the midst of trying to defend their nation, defend their borders, they stopped work on what they were doing.
Right. In other words, again, the final chapter on Chernobyl has yet to be written, and by the time all is said and done, it may well pollute 1/3 of the Earth's fresh water or more.
Exactly. That's the point I'm making, is that, look, it's still going, so don't say, oh, well, it didn't do anything to 1/3 of the Earth, so therefore, well, wait a minute. First of all, it's still unraveling. Second of all, as I do in my book and as I just did briefly with your audience, if you'll do a deep word study of that, it doesn't have to be a literal 1/3 of the entire Earth in the first place.
Gotcha.
But it could very well become that, as you said, because it's still ongoing. This is not something that happened 30 years ago and, oh, well, it went away, no big deal. That didn't affect me. Starbucks is open in my town in the United States, so everything is fine. Well, no, it's not. And this is something of worldwide significance. It's something of monumental significance. It's certainly a 1/3 event. It's maybe not 3/3, maybe not 2/3, but it's certainly significant, and it's threatening to blow again, and Russia's attacking, and now they can't rebuild it, and right there in the Scriptures, written 2,000 years ago. And what we have to do, see, I'm not dogmatically proclaiming this is that. I'm not jumping up and down saying, I have discovered something. No, millions of people around the world see this. 2 Ukrainian ambassadors spoke to it long before I ever saw it. That's the reason I started looking at it. But the bottom line is, this is either one of the biggest coincidences in the world, or it's exacting prophecy happening in our lifetime, because John, 2,000 years ago, he said that it was revealed to him, write this down, John, the name of this event that will occur in the future, that will be a warning to the world that the Lord is soon to come. The name of it, John, is Chernobyl. If he's giving it in Ukrainian, that's what he would say. He would say, It's Chernobyl, John. Write it down. It means nothing to you, and it will mean nothing for 2,000 years. But in 1986 and beyond, for those who care enough to study and read and look and see, they will get it. It will be a key word. It will unlock this mystery, and they will see and they will know that a trumpet harbinger has been sounded, and God's Word is the only place that gives it. Now, it is undeniable, Richard, the correlation between those two words, wormwood and Chernobyl. And for people who say, well, it doesn't mean that, well, go argue with 2 Ukrainian ambassadors who were born and raised in the language. They say it does mean that.
Right. Well, yes, because there are other quarters out there who are suggesting that maybe, possibly, that wormwood actually means another bitter plant from that region called mugwort. So I'll let the linguists sort of sort that out. Is it wormwood? Is it mugwort?
Yeah. Well, I sort that out in my book. I show that those words are used synonymously and interchangeably by the Ukrainian people, and I have that documented. So again,
okay.
I've gone to great detail in my book to point all that out because I know what the arguments are.
We are approaching another break here, but let's get this conversation going, and then again we'll continue. And just a reminder that at the top of the hour, fast approaching, we'll open up the lines, and you can have your questions and comments ready for Carl Gallups, who joins us here on Coast to Coast. The fourth trumpet. Following the sounding of the fourth trumpet, a third of the light that shines from the sun, moon, and stars became dark from these celestial bodies being struck. This catastrophe caused complete darkness for a third of a day, during the day, even through night hours. That's what John says regarding the fourth trumpet. Make sense of that for me. We've got about a minute, and then we'll pick it up on the other side.
I will. I don't know what translation you're using, but the original Greek doesn't say it caused complete darkness, but that is an English translation, and that's fine.
It's the Wikipedia Bible.
Do what?
It's the Wikipedia Bible.
Oh, well, there's the problem. Okay, but that's okay. No, and I'm not trying to be nitpicky. I just want to make it clear that the original Greek doesn't say that it caused complete darkness, and that's important because in this particular vision, the fourth trumpet, again, we hear that number 1/3, a third of the sun, a third of the moon, a third of the stars. So is that literal? Well, it could be, but if we take it for the symbolism, which is just immersed in all of these trumpets, again, why is everything else symbolic, but all of a sudden this has to be literal? You see what I'm saying? So
I do. Listen, okay, no, continue. Sorry, my apologies. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to say, so if it's symbolic, then it means, okay, it's not complete darkness, and it's not even major darkness, but it's enough that something that the world has to notice. Somebody's going to notice this. Something happens after Chernobyl, if you will, that then tells the world, look, here's another phenomena that you need to look at. Well, by the way, when we get to the fifth trumpet later on, that's the one that's going to blow people away. But when I looked at the third trumpet and I saw wormwood and Chernobyl and all that stuff I've already told your audience, I said, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Well, I looked at the fourth one, and I've got to admit, I scratched my head. I said, well, what in the world has happened that has caused a dimming of the light that reaches the world? And so on a whim, a fluke, of course, I'm a Christian. I come from a biblical worldview, so I believe it was the hand of God directing this. I just went to the internet and I just put in Google one day here. I don't know, a couple of years ago. I just put in the words global dimming or dimming of the light. Global dimming. To my shock, not only is there a phenomena called global dimming, but the New York Times again had a headline article that the subtitle was, in the last half of the last century, the world literally became a much darker place. I began reading that article and discovered that for the last 50 years, this is a little before Chernobyl, but now lapses over past Chernobyl and into our time, that scientists around the world have been documenting a phenomena called global dimming, and they are saying that anywhere, and this is the headline article, New York Times, the headline said anywhere from, get this, 10% to 37% reduction in the amount of light reaching the Earth, depending upon which part of the world you're in. In some parts of the world, it's as little as 10% light.
Let's hold it right there, Carl, and let that resonate in our skulls for a few moments. We'll take a time out and come back discussing the seven trumpets. Final warning, Carl Gallups here on Coast to Coast. My City Was Gone. That was written by Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders. That was the B-side to the single release Back on the Chain Gang, which was a huge, huge hit for the Pretenders back in 1982. Earlier in the program, right off the top, in fact, I mentioned an email I received from a Robert Dunn who took a video on his 3G video camera mid-afternoon last Thursday pointing it up at the sun using the negative filter, I suppose you would say. And sent me the video. I looked at it, and sure enough, as he's describing in the video, you can see this celestial object just to the left of the sun. And he suggests, Robert Dunn does, that that object may in fact be Nibiru, Planet X, which is reportedly 4 times the size and mass of Jupiter, our largest planet in the solar system. And of course, not only is this brown dwarf supposedly heading toward us, it's also bringing with it 7 other planets and a debris field. It's like its own little mini solar system. Well, we have tweeted that. If you go to the Twitter feed at Coast to Coast AM, you can see that right at the top of the Twitter feed, and just click on the link there, and it'll take you right to that video, and decide for yourself. Is that, in fact, some sort of a harbinger? Is that a sign in the sky telling us about the end times? Is it Nibiru, Planet X? Check it out and let me know. Back to my conversation with Carl Gallups, the author of Final Warning, Understanding the Trumpet Days of Revelation, when Coast to Coast AM continues right after this. All right, let's get back to that 4th trumpet blast. But before we do, Carl Gallups, why the trumpet? Well, the symbology of the horn. I'm thinking Old Testament. I'm thinking the temple. I'm thinking the ram's horn, which was sounded. In the Jewish calendar, we have the feast day of trumpets. What's the connection?
Thank you. Yeah, I do quite a in-depth study of that very question in my book, the symbolism of trumpets in the Bible. Most of the time that word is used, it is indicative of the shofar, the ram's horn kind of trumpet that has that eerie, haunting, beautiful sound that, can you imagine that resonating through the mountains of ancient Israel? So the shofar. Now, there's a few times where the word trumpet would mean something more like the silver, kind of coronet-style trumpets that we see. But the bottom line, you've asked the symbolism. Well, the very first time we see the word trumpet and hear of a trumpet blast in the Scriptures is in the book of Exodus, when the children of Israel have come out of Egypt after 400 years of slavery. They're standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses is there. Moses has told them that the Lord himself will descend upon the mountain and will speak to them. And we find out later that happens, and the people fear it so badly they beg Moses, say, please don't let this happen again. Tell God not to speak to us. Tell him to speak to you. Our hearts failed us when this happened. Well, it was preceded, of all things, first time we hear it in the Scriptures, by a mighty trumpet blast from heaven. Just the air, the sky was pierced. Remember, this was 3,000-something years ago. There were no airplanes. There was no noise pollution. It was just the birds singing and the wind blowing, and they were standing at the foot of the mountain, and the heavens filled with this shofar-like sounding trumpet blast that over 1 million people that were gathered around that mountain heard and terrified them. But it was an announcement that God himself, the presence of God, was going to descend upon the mountain. The mountain burst into flames, a smoke, a Shekinah glory of God surrounded the mountain, and God spoke to the people out of that trumpet blast. That's the first
Gabriel,
time.
come blow your horn.
Yeah, really. And so as you read through the Scriptures, and again, I did several chapters of study on it, and I want to get a quick answer to your audience. But as you read through the Scriptures, you discover that time and time and time and time again, when you hear of the trumpets being blown, it's to announce the arrival of a king, it's to call God's people to arms, to battle, it's to announce the attack of an enemy, it's to announce a coming danger. So it's always the purpose of the trumpet is not for the unbelievers so much as it is for the people of God. It's a sound from God. It's a call to worship. The trumpets are used. It's a call to proclaim that God is in His holy temple. I mean, I give all of these illustrations from the Scriptures in my book. So that's the symbolism of the trumpet. So by the time we get to Revelation, now we're in the last book. We're dealing with the last trumpets ever heard of in the Bible. And when the 7th trumpet blows, by the way, It is the very last time the word trumpet is used, so it literally is the last trumpet in the Bible.
Okay,
And
so back to the fourth trumpet, Carl. Again,
Yeah.
let me just set the stage again. We were talking about a third of the light shining from the sun,
Yeah.
moon, and stars will become dark from these celestial bodies
Yeah.
being struck.
Yeah.
What
Yeah,
is it talking about?
Yeah, that's what it says. And right before the break, I was just revealing. And again, I want to say to the audience, I am not dogmatic about this stuff. I don't jump up and down and say, this is it. My goodness, we have discovered it. This is it. I'm saying, look at these correlations. Look at these amazing either coincidences or fulfillment of prophecy. John says 2,000 years ago that near the end, there's going to be something called Chernobyl that happens, that pollutes waters and kills people. And then also, right about that same time, there's going to be a global dimming effect, if you will, that the amount of light that reaches the earth will be diminished. All right, now, let me read this to you. May 2004, the New York Times, I've got it right in front of me. The title of the article, Globe Grows Darker as Sunshine diminishes 10% to 37%. That's the headline article of the New York Times in 2004. And the very first words of that article say, in the second half of the 20th century, the world became quite literally a darker place. Now, the article goes on to describe this phenomena that is relatively recent in human history in its recording of global dimming is what they call it. It's reported by New York Times. It's reported by the BBC. It's reported by Nova. It's reported by The Guardian UK. It's reported by in American Thinker magazine. I mean, and I've got all of this documented in my book. And these scientists from around the world for the last 50 years have been recording this. And I know some people would say, well, maybe it's due to air pollution. Well, that's what they thought. They talk about this. But then they went to the Antarctic, where there is no air pollution, and they said, oh my gosh, it has dimmed down here. The amount of sunlight reaching the earth in the Antarctic, it has dimmed as well. And this article went on to say that that the very least it has dimmed is 10%, but it says in some regions like Asia, the United States, and Europe, the drop is even steeper, and in Hong Kong, in that area, it was as much as 37%. So this is a phenomena, and one of the scientists said, this is like a big gorilla sitting on the dining room table, and nobody's talking about it. And because they've been studying this for 50 years, and you've got a significant decrease in the amount of light that's reaching the earth, all over the earth.
But the fourth trumpet, Carl, the fourth trumpet says, or John writes, the light that shines from the sun, moon, and stars became dark from these celestial bodies being struck. What does that mean?
Well, I don't know what it means. But the translation I'm reading, and this is an English translation, but I can go to the Greek and look at it, but it says, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark, a third of the day was without light, and a third of the night. So, in other words, there's the amount of light reaching the earth is decreased significantly. Now, struck, I think that would simply speak to the fact that this is another harbinger. This is another warning. This is another trumpet sound. This is something that happens supernaturally. This is something that God causes to happen as a warning to the earth that these things are now taking place. If Trumpet 3 was Chernobyl, and there is no doubt that the word wormwood means Chernobyl, now, is it that Chernobyl nuclear disaster? Well, let's just say that it is. If it is, then trumpet number 4 seems to be speaking to a phenomena like global dimming. But here's the thing. Just like Chernobyl's not over, neither is this global dimming phenomena. I mean, this article was written in 2004, but there have been other articles written since then, and they're still recording this phenomena, and they still don't know what's causing it, and they don't have a clue what it's all about. But they know, starting about 50 years ago, the amount of light reaching the earth has dimmed significantly all over the world. So, so I put this, I wrote this in my book as a possibility, and I say in that chapter, I'm not prepared to say this is that, but good gracious, in light of the details we found in Trumpet 3 and the shocking details that are in Trumpet 5, the two trumpets around it, Trumpet 4, you come to that, and it talks about a global dimming effect, if you will, and you say, well, yeah, but has anything like that happened? Well, as a matter of fact, it has happened. It's been being recorded for the last 50 years, and the New York Times and the BBC and Nova and on and on and on, they're reporting on it, but very few people are talking about it.
All right, the fifth trumpet. The fifth trumpet sound is the first woe of three.
Yeah.
Before this trumpet sounds, an angel appears, flying in mid-heaven, and warns, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound." Walk us through the fifth trumpet, Carl.
Yeah. Well, I think those three woes, and I talk about this in the book, I think those are significant. I think they're speaking of time markers that starting with the fifth trumpet, it's going to start happening quickly. And again, Richard, this is going to blow your audience away if they've never seen this. This is one of the most astounding of all of them because of the statement of the woes that, look, this, Trumpet 5 is going to be bad. It's going to lead to Trumpet 6, which Trumpet 6 looks like a major world war centered in the Middle East. It says on the Euphrates River, which is right where everything is happening right now, Richard. But the bottom line is Trumpet 5, one of the most detailed. And so let me just paraphrase this. So there's another star, if you will. But this star speaks and is given a personification. So this is how we know the stars are not literal suns hitting the earth, but these are messengers, harbingers, and it speaks of a certain people that are tormented for 5 months, and it says that twice in this passage. It's a lengthy passage. 5 months, something happens to a certain people, and it says that in the midst of that tormenting, that the pits are open, the abyss, the bottomless pit is opened, and there's some fascinating word study there, and I've got it in my book. But out of that pit comes fire and smoke that fills the sky and darkens. Again, we get to this darkening effect, but it's in this specific theater. It blackens the sky. It is dark as night in the middle of the day. And then it goes on, he says, and I saw something that looked like locusts coming out of this, it looked like they had men's faces, and they sounded like chariots thundering, and they were shooting fire out of their tails. And so, again, you got John sitting on an island 2,000 years ago, thrust into our time. Looks like science fiction to him, but he's describing it. And it goes on to say, and the people, and they longed to die, but they couldn't die. They wanted to die, but they couldn't. And then it ends, watch this. It ends by saying, and they had as a king over them this messenger from this bottomless pit, or the one that kind of started all of this. Watch this, Richard. Whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek his name is Apollyon. Now, again, Richard, when you're looking at Revelation, particularly these visions, the seals, the trumpets, and everything, you come to the trumpets, and here's all of this imagery and, giant locust and fire shooting out of their tails and all these different things.
This may be the most cryptic of the seven trumpets.
Well, maybe until you get to something that is said. It says the name of the one, the messenger, the king, it says, of all things, the name of the king who starts all of this, his name is Abaddon or Apollyon. Now, Richard, Apollyon is Greek. Abaddon is Hebrew. Those two words translated to English, of course, they mean the same thing. In English, they translate to the destroyer. If you translate the words the destroyer into Persian, and Professor Thaxton Wheeler of Harvard University Persian Studies Institute confirms this. I've got it in my book. A bunch of people out of the Middle East, authorities in the Middle East, Persian language experts. It's all documented in my book. The word destroyer in Persian is Saddam. Now get this. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He was in there for 5 months before the coalition forces attacked. When they did attack, he retreated. he set 800 oil wells on fire that burned for 11 months and darkened the sky as black as midnight in the noonday sun. And that's an exact quote out of several articles, journalistic articles that came right out of the Gulf War during those days. Not only that, but after all of this was over, and of course, what caused it? It caused this coalition of forces, thousands of tanks crawling across the desert, shooting fire out of their tails, if you will. Thousands of helicopters filling the sky, flying through the smoke. There are pictures on the internet of those oil wells on fire, and you can see tanks and helicopters and just the nasty mess and the war and the killing and the destruction and everything.
Let me stop you there because let me now reiterate what the fifth trumpet says, because you've given this wonderful, this horrific mental imagery here, and it says regarding the fifth trumpet, the star is given the key to the bottomless pit. After opening it, the smoke that rises out darkens the air and blocks the sunlight. You're saying those are the oil wells lit on fire. Then from out of the smoke, the locusts were unleashed. They were scorpion-tailed war horses, having a man's face with lion's teeth. So again, this imagery, evokes images of fighter planes and tanks and
helicopters, attack helicopters. Yep.
Okay, continue.
Yeah, and it goes on to say, and their wings sounded like thundering chariots. Well, if you've ever heard tanks rolling across the ground, or if you've ever heard attack helicopters, coming out of the sky, that's exactly what it sounds like. Exactly. So again, John, if this is what this is, he's nailing it. But here's the deal. Here's what I want to really go back and emphasize. It ends by saying, if you're reading it in Persian, let's just say you're reading all of this in Persian, this vision ends by saying, by the way, the king who started all of this, his name is Saddam. Now write that down, John. That means nothing to you, and it'll mean nothing for 2,000 years. But there will come a time in history when a king named Saddam is going to invade a people for 5 months, and he's going to cause smoke to come out of the ground and fire, and it's going to blacken the sky, and people are going to be in torment from it for a long time. Write it down. His name is Saddam. And when it happens, then the world will see. And I'm telling you, Richard, again, I'm not jumping up and down saying this is that. I'm not betting my life on it, but I'm saying it cannot be denied that Abaddon and Apollyon, the name of the king, translates in Persian to Saddam. It cannot be denied that Saddam was in Kuwait for 5 months before we went in there. It cannot be denied that he set 800 oil wells on fire, which are bottomless pits, if you will, ushering out fire and smoke, darkening the sky. It cannot be denied that tanks and helicopters and airplanes by the thousands crawling across the desert and flying through the skies to a man 2,000 years ago, the only way you could describe them is it looks like giant locusts shooting fire out of their tails. Then it goes on to say that people in those days longed to die, but they couldn't. Here's one of the most horrific facts. And all of this is documented heavily in my book. In fact, I spend a whole chapter on this. I go to journalistic sources, historical sources, military sources, that describe the death camps of Saddam Hussein. He imprisoned thousands of little children. He tortured them, brutalized them, raped them, often in front of their parents. Some of them he would burn. Some of them he would burn to death. But most of them he tortured to the point of death, and then they kept them alive for years.
All right, Carl. The sixth trumpet awaits on the other side. Back with more of my conversation with Carl Gallups right here on Coast to Coast AM. My name is Richard Serrett. Stay a while. There she is, Linda Ronstadt, fighting a very brave battle with Parkinson's disease, which has sadly silenced her. She will sing no more, but we have her records and her music will live on. We are talking about the end times, the book of Revelation, and the seven trumpets with author, broadcaster, pastor Carl Gallups, and we will get back to that conversation and your calls, questions, and comments in just a few moments. Great quote here I love from comedian Scott Robin, who's got a very funny website. It's called dribbleglass.com. And Scott says, "They say God has existed from the beginning of time and will exist beyond the end of time. Can you imagine trying to sit through his home movies? Back with more of Coast to Coast in just a moment. Pastor Carl Gallups is with us. The book Final Warning, Understanding the Trumpet Days of Revelation. And our good listeners, Carl, are lining up with questions and comments. So let us begin on the wild card line. Robert is in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Robert, good morning. Welcome.
Yeah, how you doing? Good morning. I'd like to start off saying that I'm a Coast to Coast insider, and I've been with you guys for about 20 years, going all the way back to Art Bell.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yes, and also I'd like to say your guest is right on the money, and I'm a student of Enochian magic. If is he aware of that? And everything he says is pretty much on the money, and I've studied the books of Enoch 1 and 2 and 3. But one of my reasons I call is to explain the wormwood. The wormwood was originally discovered when the Polish made a drink called absinthe. That was the drink he was looking for, the name of the alcoholic drink. Absinthe. What they used to do is they made it in oak barrels, and they would put it in the woods to ferment. And the wormwood vine used to grow inside the barrels, inside the alcoholic drink. And the wormwood vine actually has hallucinogenic properties to it. So that's when they first started drinking it, and the wormwood got into the drink. Everybody started liking it because, of course, they were all hallucinating. So that's where the wormwood actual drink.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that, Robert. All right, I appreciate that. Did you want to add anything to that, Carl?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you, Robert. First of all, thanks for listening to the show tonight, and thanks for your comment and addition, and thank you for helping me to remember the drink and what was involved in it. I think some of that's in my book. But the other thing I would point out before we go to other callers, Richard, is that the term wormwood, and again, we're using that English term, but there's also a Hebrew equivalent for it, and that term is used 7 times. There's that number 7 again, in the Old Testament, and every single time it's always a sign of some woe, of some judgment, if you will, some terrible thing, some calamity happening. And so the next time we hear of it, the only time we ever hear of it again is when we get to the book of Revelation, the 3rd trumpet prophecy, and he says, write this down. The name of it is, and if you're writing it in Ukraine, it is Chernobyl. And, of course, in the Ukraine, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred, which polluted waters, land, killed a bunch of people, still killing people, still polluting land and waters, still a threat to the world. That trumpet is still blowing, if you will, right out of today's headline news with Ukraine and Russia, and Ukraine desperately trying to seal that sarcophagus. So that term is so significant, and John gave us that name. So thank you, Robert, for helping me to remember the name of the drink that ties to that particular plant. That's where it originates. That's where the understanding originates, yes.
Okay, let's say hello next to, again, on the wild card line. Edward is in Santa Clara, California. Good morning, Edward.
Good morning. Just want to mention that I've been watching these YouTube video clips of what some people think might be Nibiru next to the sun. It's got a few of those video clips on there, and I was wondering if that might be causing the Earth to turn off its axis. Some people believe that might be the case, and that's why we're getting so many earthquakes and volcano eruptions, the ice melting. We're in a drought out here in the Pacific side. I heard all the way down to South America, while the Northeast is getting all the snow. What are your thoughts on that?
Carl, I mentioned receiving a video in an email from a gentleman in Pennsylvania this very night talking about Nibiru, this brown dwarf. Some believe is heading this way. Anything in the Bible, in Revelation, that speaks to that?
Not that I'm aware of, Richard, and I am vaguely aware of Nibiru. I've done some reading on it, but not enough to speak intelligently about it. I think you probably know a whole lot more about it than I do, but I don't know of any correlation in the Scriptures, and particularly the book of Revelation, to it.
All right, let's move along. We have a lot of people waiting, so let's get to Cornelius in Louisiana. Cornelius, good morning and welcome aboard.
Good morning, Carl and Richard. God bless both y'all, and Gina, your call screener. I'm a long-time listener, too. I'm from the Art Bell days also, and I believe in Bible prophecy. The only thing I differ with Richard on, or Carl, I should say, is this on the rapture. That's the only difference. But everything else I believe in stuff. And I was telling Gina, I was saying, have you studied like the 4 blood moons with them coming up and the harbingers, like
Jonathan Cahn has talked about that.
Well,
yes.
it's Mark Belts that wrote the book.
Mark Belts and John Hagee, 4 blood moons. Yes. And I hope you get on Glenn Beck's show, too, because, like I said, you're real good. I like you. I've listened to you. I've seen you on some different programs and heard you on the radio and stuff. And I'll take my answer off the air. God bless you, and thank you.
Thank you, Cornelius. Go ahead, Carl.
Well, thank you, Cornelius. Yeah, excuse me. Well, you said you just disagreed with me on the rapture, and I want to speak to that very, very quickly, and I'm certainly not going to argue with you on it because there's so many views on it. and I'll tell you what my view is, and it might surprise you pleasantly. You asked if I knew anything about the blood moon phenomenon. Yes, I do. Jonathan Cahn, I know him personally. In fact, my last book, The Rabbi That Found Messiah, he was in that book and in the documentary movie that was made about the book. He's in that movie with me, and so I do know him. Pastor Mark Belts wrote the book, The Blood Moons, and of course John Hagee as well. Yes, and I'm familiar with that. And the end of that tetrad, it started last year. The end of it comes up in the fall of this year, and it's a phenomenon that happens very, very rarely. And what Mark Belts does is and John Hagee is they document what they believe to be correlations between when these things happen over the last several thousand years. I think it's happened 7 or 8 times, and in almost every one of those situations, something very profound has happened that relates specifically, usually, to the nation of Israel. And these blood moons always occur on of these tetrads. They don't always occur here, but these tetrads they occur on the feast, the spring feast and the fall feast. The 7 feasts of the Lord that comes straight out of the Scriptures. So there's that biblical correlation. So yes, I'm familiar with that phenomena. It's interesting because, Richard, not only is the ending of this tetrad going to happen this fall, which has a lot of prophecy watchers kind of really looking at this fall, particularly around September when all of this kind of comes to a culmination. Not only does that happen, but it's the end of the Shemitah cycle, which is what Jonathan Cahn has most recently written to, this cycle of this 7-year cycle that the Scriptures speak of, and that Jonathan Cahn has recorded, that these 7-year cycles also correspond to not very good things that have happened, particularly as it relates to America and
the stock market. And the stock market.
Yeah, and the stock market, and so that's happening all at about the same time that the blood moons are happening. And then you referenced earlier on, Richard, an article that was in WND headlines today. And matter of fact, I'm quoted in that article. They interviewed me for that article about the rebuilding of the holy altar to go in the new temple that they hope to build in Israel. And that altar has been built, that altar of sacrifice. And according to the people that are involved in building this, it's ready to be used. I mean, it's ready to go. And
why is that significant in terms of biblical prophecy? Why is that important?
And I'm quoted in that article, and I would refer people to that article to get all the details. I'll just give the quick answer to that. The quick answer is that students of prophecy know that there are several places in the Scripture that speak of in the last days, sacrifices, apparently in the temple area, perhaps involving an actual rebuilt temple eventually and ultimately, but also sacrifices occurring on the altar, which the abomination that causes desolation, or the Antichrist, or the lawless one, or all these different biblical terms, will try to bring a halt to those sacrifices, and will begin to persecute the people of God, Jews and Christians. So students of the Bible know that in the last days, before the return of the Lord, that somehow there had to be, well, first of all, there had to be a return to Israel. Well, that's happened. Secondly, Jerusalem had to belong to that return to Israel. Well, that happened in 1967, so check that off the box. Then there had to be an interest in rebuilding a third temple. Well, that's going on right now. Now, the temple hasn't been rebuilt, but there are plans made, and people are very, very seriously involved in that, Orthodox Jews and whole, institutions and organizations are. Then, of course, there had to be a rebuilding of an altar, and the reemergence of sacrifices upon the altar according to the Levitical tradition and according to the Word of God. Well,
and there are also ranchers
says that's happened now.
And there are also ranchers in Texas that are trying to produce a red heifer without blemish, because that plays into it as well. And so, which leads me to wonder whether there aren't people out there who are almost trying to hasten the end times. Isn't there a little bit of danger in the idea, and the self-fulfilling prophecy, when you have people who are consciously trying to bring these things into the fore and to make them happen? Isn't there a danger there?
Well, certainly there could be, Richard, of course, and especially if there are evil or ill conceived notions behind it all. But on the other hand, to balance that question out, and the answer to it is the phenomena that God works through real people and through real nations and real kingdoms and real empires and real centers of power, and so there's the Scripture, and you call it self-fulfilling if you want, or you can call it just the fulfillment of what God knew would happen, what He knew people would do. So the lines kind of blur a little bit, Richard. But you're right. I mean, if somebody just picks up the Bible and says, "Hey, I'm going to start making these things happen," of course, most of them, can't be made. But some details could. Then you have to kind of raise an eyebrow, right? But no, I'm aware of those articles as well of the red heifer thing, and and now we've got the altar being rebuilt and ready to go and announced in the last few days. WorldNet Daily ran the headline article on it. So the Shemitah cycle, the blood moon cycle, all of that happening this year. And
it's a convergence. It's a convergence. Let's say hi to Charles in Baltimore. Charles, good morning. You're on the line with Carl Gallups.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say I hope that you get that book. That book becomes in Braille through the Library of Congress Braille book program. They have for the blind. I'd like to see that in Braille. One day that will become a reality, because they have other books by other people, and I don't think they're as credible like yours. But anyway, okay, we're talking about the end times, and okay, the seventh trumpet that's supposed to come eventually. How long is that going to take? Could it be next year, next month, or even thousands of years?
Yeah.
Because how often have people been talking about the end times, that it's going to end, it's going to end? I mean, we heard that 20, 30, 40, maybe 100 years ago.
Oh, Charles, listen, what an excellent, excellent question you have asked. In fact, I deal with that in a chapter in my book. God bless you for asking that. You're a great thinker, Charles. No, it more than 100 years ago. How about 2,000 years ago? How about all the way back to the early church? They were expecting the coming of the Lord. They were expecting the coming of the Lord in their lifetime. In fact, some teachers were even going around saying that it had already happened. In fact, Paul had to warn the Thessalonican church in 2 Thessalonians that, don't listen to these false teachers. It hasn't happened, and he says certain things have to happen before it does, and he lays out a few, some of the signs. But the bottom line is, and Richard used the word a moment ago, Charles, convergence. See, that's the key, because the Scriptures tell us that before the coming of the Lord, Israel was going to come back to the land, number one. Number two, Ezekiel 38 says that a certain coalition of nations would form that would come against Israel. Jerusalem would be recaptured. There would be, something having to do with a new temple and an altar, and those kinds of things would be going on. If the 6 trumpets occur before the rapture, and if the 7th trumpet is the rapture, which I and millions of other Bible students believe that's the case, we could be wrong. I tell people, look, I could be wrong about this. I'm not dogmatic about it. I don't break fellowship with other believers if they believe differently. But if that's the case, then these other things have to happen, like Chernobyl, like Saddam and the Gulf War. And that, by the way, that Gulf War, the New York Times ran a lengthy article connecting the Gulf War all the way through to ISIS of today. And they made all of the links, and they said if it wasn't for Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, we wouldn't be where we are in the Middle East today. So in answering your question, Charles, the bottom line is, yes, for 2,000 years people have said maybe us, maybe us, maybe us. But what prophecy experts are saying now, and I'm not going to call myself an expert, but I've been a preacher and teacher of the Word for 30 years and an author, so I'm going to say that what we're saying now is what Richard said, but yes, this is the first time in history, in the last 2,000 years, Charles, where there is a convergence of specific prophecies, and we're the only generation in the history of the world to see it. Israel is back in the land. That happened in our historical lifetime. The nations of Ezekiel 38 are forming a coalition to destroy Israel. That happened in our historical lifetime. Jerusalem was recaptured. That happened in our historical lifetime alone. And on and on and on we can go. If the 3rd trumpet is Chernobyl, that happened in our lifetime and only our lifetime. If the 5th trumpet was the Gulf War started by King Saddam, that happened in our lifetime and only our lifetime. So there's the key, Charles. Now we're dealing with a convergence of specific, powerful, detailed scriptures only in our generation. So I don't set dates and times. It could be in the next, few weeks or months. It could be years. It could be 100 years. It could be 200 years. But I think, and a lot of other prophecy scholars believe, that it's going to be sooner rather than later. It looks like we're all very close to the return of the Lord. Again, I'm not setting dates, and I don't go around holding signs saying the sky is falling. I'm just looking at what the Scripture says, and I'm looking at what has converged in our lifetime, Charles. Does that help you understand that?
Oh, yes. And, you sound more credible than, say, Mr. Camping was, who made that big prediction couple of years ago from Family Radio.
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't make predictions, Charles, my brother. God bless you. I don't make specific predictions. And even in my book, Final Warning, I'm very clear. I try to handle it as journalistically as possible and as balanced and as objective as possible. I'm very clear that, look, I'm just
yes, you do that.
You the evidence.
Absolutely.
Take a look at it. It's either coincidence or it's prophecy.
All right, Carl. Listen, we're going to head into a break here, and when we come back on the other side, though, we'll take more calls. People are lining up, but we also have to get to that 6th trumpet. We'll do that when Coast to Coast continues. On the other side, here is the Black Crowes, Soul Singing. It's a great tune. Too Much Rain, Paul McCartney, from what I think is one of his best albums ever, post-Beatles, and this came out about 10 years ago. The name of the album, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, and I don't believe it got the due that it deserves. I think it marks really the reemergence of McCartney from after a kind of a fallow period, but it's, I think, just a brilliant album. Every track is noteworthy. Too Much Rain. Back to my conversation in just mere moments with Carl Gallup, senior pastor and broadcaster, author. His book, Final Warning, Understanding the Trumpet Days of Revelation. Let me just give you a taste of what's coming up here as we discuss, or will discuss, the 6th trumpet. 5 months after the 5th trumpet blast, the 6th one sounds. This is the second woe, where 4 angels are released from their binds to the great river Euphrates. They command a brute force of 200 million mounted troops, whose dark horses dissipate plague from out of their mouths, most notably fire, smoke, and brimstone. The mounted horsemen wore breastplates with the color of fire, hyacinth, and brimstone. The horses had a lion's head, and their tails were like a serpent, even with a snake head. They are responsible for the deaths of a third of mankind, who are stricken by the plague that emanated from these armies. Carl Gallups will be back in just a moment to make sense of this, the sixth trumpet, when Coast to Coast continues. Stay with us. Before we get back to the sixth trumpet, Carl, let's go back to the phones. People are being very patient, and we've got a full board of lines. Let's work as many in as we possibly can, and we'll begin with Michelle in Marinette, Wisconsin. Michelle, good morning and welcome aboard. Is Michelle there? Going once, twice. We lost Michelle. Okay. Tim is in Miami, Oklahoma, on the first-time caller list. Tim.
Yeah, thanks for playing the McCartney. And I'd like to ask, who do you think the two witnesses will be that it mentions in the Bible, angels or maybe Ezekiel?
Carl, the two witnesses.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. You know what? You've asked a question that really needs about a 30 to 40-minute answer, but of course I can't do that. I'm going to have to give you the 2 or 3 minute answer. Now, I will tell you my book has an entire chapter or two, several chapters devoted to answering that. But let me just give you this. Let me give you this to think about. It could wind up being two literal men, although the scriptures in the original Greek don't say two men. I know some translations do, but the word men is not there. It just says, these two shall prophesy. These two will do this. But in Revelation 11, verse 7, Tim, it says, the two witnesses are... Now, there's some key words, Richard and Tim. The two witnesses are the two olive trees and the two lampstands. Now, again, this takes a long time, but I'm going to do this quickly. So it says the two are the two olive trees and the two lampstands. Well, does that mean there's four? No, it means they're all one and the same. There's two witnesses, but the two literally become one. There's two olive trees, two lampstands. Now, it's important that those key words are given, because those words are defined in the Scriptures, Tim. In Romans chapter 11, it clearly says, that entire chapter says, the olive tree is Israel. The lampstand in Revelation, the same book where that word is used, Revelation chapter 1, verse 20, says the lampstand is the church. So we've got to start with what the Scripture says, Tim, and it says the two witnesses are, and for sake of simplicity for this brief discussion, the two witnesses are the olive tree and the lampstand. Well, then if we use the definitions right out of the Bible, the two witnesses are Israel and the church. Now, that's interesting, because Israel has always been a witness to the world of God's glory, and that the Word of God is His Word. And a returned Israel in the last days certainly would be a last days witness to the world that God's Word is true, and it's only in God's Word where it predicted that Israel would return. So it certainly is a witness. Well, the church is a witness. The last thing Jesus said to the disciples when He ascended, you shall be my witnesses into the whole earth. Of course, we're witnessing the gospel of Jesus Christ right up to the end. So if we just start with what the Scripture says, Tim, the two witnesses are the olive tree and the lampstand, Israel and the church. Now, could it also be lived out in two literal men in downtown Jerusalem in the last days? Could be. We'll have to watch that unfold. The Scriptures do not say emphatically that it's two men, nor does it give names like Moses and Elijah or Enoch and all of these names that various interpretations give. But there are attributes of those guys. So,
all right.
Again, Tim, I could go on for an hour, and I've got to end it now, but if we deal with what Revelation 11:7 says, you definitely have to start with a returned Israel as a witness, and the church is a witness up until the very end, until the church is raptured.
All right, let's get to that sixth trumpet, Carl.
Yeah.
5 months, it says. 5 months after the fifth trumpet blast, the sixth one sounds. Well, I'm confused already, because it has been obviously more than 5 months since the Gulf War.
Can I tell you why you're confused, Richard? Because you're reading the Wikipedia translation.
All right. So
you,
set
Richard,
me
the
straight.
Bible doesn't come anywhere near close to saying that. I don't know what version you're reading. It's a paraphrased edition, though, and it's not a literal translation from the Greek. I've got the Greek and the English in front of me, and nowhere does it even come close to saying that the sixth trumpet happens 5 months later.
Okay, explain the sixth trumpet then.
Whoever did that translation kind of blended the fifth and the sixth trumpet together like that, but the Greek does not say that. But anyway, the sixth trumpet speaks of an amazing thing. This is one of the woes, one of the final woes, and it started with the fifth trumpet. And if that was the Gulf War, watch how this ties together. The sixth trumpet seems to be, many people around the world and prophecy experts believe that we're looking at the sixth trumpet, we're looking at a possible World War III scenario, because it talks about 200 million troops that are fighting this battle. But watch this. It tells us where it's going to happen. And it's amazing because it says it's going to happen along the Euphrates River. Well, Richard, the Euphrates River starts in the mountains of northern Turkey, runs through Turkey, runs through Syria, runs through Iraq, and empties into the Persian Gulf. Now, those three nations I just named are the hotbed of Islam in the Middle East and the hotbed of what is happening now with the wars and the civil wars and ISIS and ISIL and the desire to take over the Middle East. It's also the hotbed of what's the word I'm looking for coalitions and conspiracies of nations joining together to attack Israel. Now we've got Iran coming into Iraq to help them battle ISIS. Iran is just looking to gain more territory. The scriptures say that in the last days Persia will join that coalition. Well, Persia is Iran. Iranians are Persians. They're not Arabic. They're Persians. And that's where we get the Persian language, for Saddam, etc. So I mean, all of this ties together. In the sixth trumpet, it speaks of this monumental war that's going to take place in the Middle East, in the hotbed of what's happening right now. But get this, Richard, this is what's so astoundingly striking about this. Again, in my book, I document this profusely with impeccable resources, but I refer to an article in the New York Times, of all places, one of the most left-leaning mainstream media sources in the world, but even they say, and they pull from various military sources and geopolitical sources, but they say that where we are now with ISIS is a direct result of the Gulf War, Saddam invading Kuwait. And here's the quick breakdown. Saddam invades Kuwait. Of course, he messes with the oil supply, sets oil wells on fire. Nations of the world run over there. We try to stop that mess from happening. And, of course, the Gulf War's over in 100 days, and we're victorious, and yay, we won, and finally we put the oil wells out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then 10 years later, 9/11 happens. Osama bin Laden declares, and I've got all this documented, that 9/11 happened because we were in Kuwait and Iraq and because we had troops on Saudi soil at our air base over there. And the Muslims were just horrified by all of that we would do that. So retaliation was 9/11. Well, 9/11 led to us going to Iraq and Afghanistan for 10 or 12 years. Then Obama comes in office, and Obama and Hillary Clinton take credit for initiating or helping to initiate Arab Spring as a result of all of that, and pulling troops out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan, opening the way for even more rise of terrorism, which they're talking about that on the news now. And so Arab Spring happens, Libya falls, Egypt falls to civil war. Daniel chapter 11 talks about that. Isaiah, I think it's chapter 19, talks about that happening in the last days. We've got Syria blowing up on fire, Damascus, a target, Turkey now becoming totally Islamic, Iraq in a mess, Iran is in Iraq, ISIL, ISIS, and the New York Times says it all is tied together, and it all started, watch this, by a man named Saddam, which is what Trumpet 5 says. And Trumpet 6 says the very last thing that's going to happen before the return of the Lord is there's going to be a monumental war taking place in the Middle East along the Euphrates River. And I'm saying to people, look, this is all a collection of unbelievable coincidences, or it's prophecy being fulfilled before our eyes. Israel's back in the land. The nations have aligned themselves. Jerusalem belongs to Israel. The altar is being built. The nations are aligning themselves. Everything's happening along the Euphrates River. Chernobyl, Wormwood has happened. Global dimming is going on and continuing to go on. Trumpet number 4. Trumpet 5. A man named Saddam starts the Gulf War that leads us to where we are now in the Middle East. Trumpet 6. A major war on the Euphrates River breaks out in the Middle East. And
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say this, and then I'll stop. And get this. It says that there are 4 angels, now this is interesting, that are posted there. And it says, release those 4 angels now. They've been held for this day, for this hour. In other words, there's something supernatural about this. There's something spiritual about this war. Well, guess what? If war breaks out in the Middle East tomorrow of this monumental magnitude, it is spiritual, Richard. It is Islamic-driven. It's a hatred for Jews and Christians, and even the Muslims in the Middle East are saying, we're doing this to bring about the apocalypse. They want their Messiah to come back. They want the Mahdi, their Messiah, to reign.
Let's just modify that. Let's modify that. Let's modify that. The extremist element within
Well, yes, of course,
Islam.
of course.
Yes, it's important to do
saying that. But that is the teaching now of the Quran and the teachings and the writings of Muhammad, that the Mahdi has to return. So, but the extremists are actually trying to usher it in. Richard, you're right, and they're proclaiming that they're doing this. That's what ISIS and ISIL is all about. And it's interesting that trumpet number 6 says, not only will there be this massive war in the Middle East through Turkey, Syria, Iraq, but it is very spiritually driven.
All right, let's get Barbara worked in here. Barbara's on the international line calling from Vancouver. Barbara, welcome and good morning.
Yes, and I'm here to actually say to Carl that I believe you are right on, and I'd like to just pass on this, that I feel I should. My grandmother came from Ukraine in 1901. In 1953, I was a young child of 6, and my grandmother was dying, and she told me to come to her bedside, and she had something very important to tell me, that her grandmother had passed on to her. And she said her grandmother in Ukraine had told her that one day she would see people flying, and she had done so with the airplanes. But most important, and there were other things, but to get to the point, most important was she told me that I would probably be alive in the year 2000, and if I was, that I would have very important decisions to make somewhere after 2000, because the Lord had given us 2,000 years, and that I may be meeting the Lord at that time. She encouraged me to be ready, and she told me to pass it along like she had. I have passed it on to my daughter, and now as a Coast insider and listening for many years, I've had the opportunity to pass it along to many others, as you, Carl, have been called to do so. And I just thank you for the opportunity. I do think that what you're saying is absolutely true. And in 1953, at 6 years old, I had no idea what my grandmother was talking about.
Barbara, I appreciate the call. Thank you.
Yeah, Barbara, God bless you, and I hear the trembling in your voice as you speak. I know this is very real to you. Barbara, please hear me. I'm not a sensationalist. I'm really not. I've just recorded in this book what I have been seeing for 25 years, Barbara. And I really hesitated to write this book, Richard and Barbara, because I knew that it would stir up the eschatological world. It goes against some of the most popular teaching in eschatology. I knew that. But I also saw these things. I saw these word connections. I saw these things for 25 years, and I've been watching it unfold over the years. And then along comes Saddam and the oil wells and Apollyon, Abaddon, and I was just shocked when I started reading news articles that said, in Persian, the destroyer Saddam. I said, oh my gosh. And now look where we are. And now Trumpet 6 and the Euphrates. And so, Barbara, I tell people, look, I could be wrong. I'm open to correction. I almost pray I'm wrong in some of these aspects. I'm not dogmatic about it, and I don't say to people, if you don't believe what I've written in my book, you're wrong. I don't say that. I'm just saying, look what is there. Look at the word connections. Look what's happening in history. Look what the Bible has been saying. Israel is back in the land, and here we are, right at the verge of World War III. Richard, just a couple of weeks ago, the Pope said, the Pope said, look, we're at the verge of World War III. A Ukrainian ambassador, again from Ukraine, he said, we're at the verge of World War III.
Ronald Reagan's former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Paul Craig Roberts, has said the same thing.
Yes, a major Muslim cleric out of Pakistan said, we're at the verge of World War III. Former CIA operatives have gone on record saying that the United States has contingency plans, for like 13 different plans for World War III scenario in the Middle East. I mean, this is real stuff. And yet you read the scriptures and the trumpet visions, and you've got Wormwood, Chernobyl, Apollyon, Saddam, Euphrates River, something spiritual happening, Turkey, Syria, Iraq. I mean, it's all there. And it was written 2,000 years ago. And again, the convergence. You used the word, Richard. That's a perfect word. You nailed it. The convergence. It all started when Israel came back to the land. And let's face it, Richard, that's what all this is about right now in the Middle East. It's about Israel. They don't want Israel there. They can't have their Mahdi. They can't have their Muslim empire until Israel is gone. And they can't get rid of Israel until they can weaken and destroy the United States, because we have been standing with Israel. This is biblical stuff, Richard. This is prophetic stuff. And
Carl,
that's what my book does. It just outlines this stuff, and it gives people an opportunity to measure it and make your own decision.
All right, Barbara, and all those that we didn't get to, thank you. My apologies for those we didn't get to. Carl, always a pleasure. Thank you. Final warning, understanding the 7 trumpets of Revelation. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Richard. God bless you.
For George Norrie, Lisa Lyons, Stephanie Smith, Chris Burrows, Brian Opry, Gina Salvati, Dan Galante, Sean Ladisore, and here in Toronto, Michael Stringer, Wes Atkinson, Scotty Guest, and Gord Harris, I'm Richard Serrett. Thank you for your voices, your beautiful voices.